Welcome, lost souls. You've just stepped into Lilith Alastor Official, a place where horror meets passion, and every heartbeat might be your last. If you love eerie tales, dark romance, and spine-tingling short stories that blur the line between the living and the damned, you're in the right place. I publish a new story every week, each one a descent into something a little more unsettling, and maybe a little more beautiful. So if that sounds like your kind of night, leave a like, whisper your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to join the growing coven that gathers here every week. And for those who want to go deeper into the darkness, to support my work and unlock extra perks including full ebooks and audiobook versions, you can join my Patreon. The links are in my bio. Thanks so much. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let the story begin. Discover the chilling legacy that hunts you from beyond the grave. When Clara inherits her family's mysterious Victorian mansion, she uncovers a terrifying supernatural inheritance that transforms family history into a nightmare of dimensional horror. One dollhouse. Infinite secrets. Some legacies are better left buried. Prepare for a psychological thriller that blurs the lines between reality and supernatural manipulation, where every room holds a deadly secret, and family history becomes a trap, more intricate than you could ever imagine. Are you ready to face the truth that's been waiting generations to be unleashed? A mind-bending descent into generational madness that will make you question everything you know about inheritance, family, and the thin membrane separating our world from something far more sinister. Chapter 1. The gravel crunched beneath worn tires like brittle bones, each turn of the wheel bringing Clara closer to the mansion that had haunted the periphery of her family's whispered conversations. Shadows stretched long across the overgrown lawn, ancient oak trees creating a tunnel of darkness that seemed to swallow her rental car whole. The Victorian house rose before her, a monument of weathered gray stone and peeling paint, its multiple windows like lidless eyes watching her approach. Clara killed the engine, the sudden silence pressing against her ears. Her fingers, still trembling from grief and the long drive, gripped the steering wheel. The mansion had always been more myth than memory, a place her parents spoke of only in hushed, uncomfortable tones. Now, with their recent deaths, it was hers, an inheritance she hadn't wanted, couldn't refuse. The front door groaned open with a sound like a long-held breath finally released. Dust danced in the weak afternoon light, settling on antique furniture draped in yellowed sheets. Her footsteps echoed through rooms that felt simultaneously familiar and foreign, as if she were walking through a memory only half remembered. A glass-fronted cabinet caught her attention. Dozens of porcelain dolls stood in perfect, unnatural alignment, their painted faces a chorus of identical expressions. Pale china cheeks, rosebud lips, eyes that seemed to follow her without moving. Clara's reflection wavered in the glass, her own face a stark contrast to their manufactured perfection. "Just dolls," she muttered, the words sounding thin and unconvincing even to her own ears. The attic stairs protested each step, wood creaking with decades of accumulated weight and memory. Cobwebs brushed her face like spectral fingers, making her shiver. And then she saw it. The dollhouse. Not a child's plaything, but a masterpiece of architectural precision, an exact miniature of the mansion itself. Clara leaned closer, her breath catching. Every detail was replicated with impossible accuracy. The carved moldings, the precise arrangement of furniture, even the dust seemed captured in microscopic suspension. Her fingers hovered over the tiny rooms, not quite touching, sensing something fundamentally wrong about the miniature world. In the dollhouse's library, one ceramic doll stood slightly askew. Its hand, delicate as spun glass, seemed to point toward a specific bookshelf. Clara blinked, certain the positioning was intentional. Sunset bled through the attic's grimy windows, casting long shadows that seemed to move independent of any light source. The doll's glass eyes caught the dying light, transforming from blank stares to something more, something watching, waiting. A chill ran down Clara's spine. For just a moment she was certain the dolls had shifted. Not dramatically, just a subtle realignment that suggested an intelligence far beyond their porcelain shells. Something whispered at the edge of her perception. Not words, exactly, but a presence. A warning. Welcome home, the house seemed to say. Clara wasn't sure if the thought was her own. Chapter 2. The mansion's silence pressed against Clara's ears like a physical weight. Moonlight spilled through dust-laden windows, casting long shadows across the Victorian study where the dollhouse stood, a miniature universe of intricate perfection. Her fingers hovered above the delicate landscape, trembling slightly as she noticed something was different. The porcelain doll that had been positioned in the study's miniature corner was now seated in the bedroom. Clara blinked, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't moved it, she was certain. Before she could process the impossibility, her body began to move, not of her own volition, but with a dreamlike automaticity that made her skin crawl. Her bare feet whispered against the wooden floor, carrying her precisely to the mansion's bedroom. Only when she crossed the threshold did she realize what had happened, her physical movement mirroring the doll's impossible journey. "No," she whispered, the word barely more than a breath. Her leather-bound journal lay open on a nearby table, pages already filled with frantic diagrams and notes. Interconnected lines mapped the strange synchronicities she'd been experiencing, each connection more unsettling than the last. Her handwriting deteriorated from neat script to jagged, almost desperate scrawls that seemed to vibrate with nervous energy. When her hand accidentally knocked against the dollhouse, the tiny crystal vase teetered and fell. Clara watched, transfixed, as it shattered into microscopic fragments across the miniature floor. The sound of breaking crystal was instantaneous, but not from the dollhouse. In the kitchen, a real crystal vase crashed to the floor, exploding into identical shards. Clara's heart raced. Her fingers, still hovering above the dollhouse, trembled so violently she could barely control them. Each movement felt like a potential trigger, each observation a dangerous invitation to something beyond her comprehension. The dollhouse seemed to breathe. Not literally. Clara knew how ridiculous that would sound, but there was something alive about its intricate details. The wallpaper patterns seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. The tiny furniture appeared to rearrange themselves in her peripheral vision. As midnight approached, Clara found herself standing motionless before the dollhouse. The moonlight cast strange, elongated shadows that seemed to move independently of any physical object. And then, impossibly, a miniature figure slowly turned its head. Its painted eyes met hers. Intelligence burned within those tiny porcelain orbs, a knowing, ancient intelligence that suggested this was more than a simple toy, more than a mere replica of the mansion. This was something else entirely. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The figure continued to stare, unblinking. She understood then that the dollhouse was not just observing her, it was studying her, cataloging her, preparing something she couldn't yet comprehend. Her grandmother's legacy was not a gift. It was a trap, and Clara was already caught within its intricate, merciless design. Chapter 3. The afternoon light filtered through the study's tall windows, casting long shadows across Clara's workspace. Yellowed letters spread before her like archaeological fragments, each brittle page a potential key to the labyrinth of her family's history. Her fingers, pale and slightly trembling, traced the faded ink of her grandmother Sylvia's handwriting, each curve and line a whisper from the past. Dust danced in the sunbeams, settling softly on documents that seemed to breathe with a history both fragile and oppressive. Clara leaned closer, squinting at a letter dated decades earlier, her breath catching in her throat as familiar phrases jumped out, words that seemed to echo her own recent experiences of isolation and creeping psychological unease. The local historical society felt like a tomb of forgotten memories. Sarah, the town historian, moved papers with nervous energy, her hands betraying a reluctance that spoke volumes. Clara watched her carefully, noting how Sarah's eyes would dart away whenever Sylvia's name was mentioned. "Your grandmother was complicated," Sarah finally said, her voice low and measured. "Not many in town spoke about her openly." A cryptic photograph emerged from an old family album, Sylvia standing alone in a misty forest clearing, surrounded by trees marked with strange symbolic etchings. The image sent a chill down Clara's spine. The markings looked deliberate, ritualistic, carved with a precision that suggested something more than mere woodland wanderings. As evening approached, Clara's study transformed. The walls became a complex web of interconnected research photographs pinned with red string, documents overlapping like a mad cartographer's map of psychological terrain. Her reflection in the moonlit window looked increasingly fragmented, her own face seeming to blend with the images of her grandmother. Transcribing Sylvia's letters became an act of psychological archaeology. Clara's hands moved mechanically, her mind absorbing passages that seemed to pulse with an unsettling familiarity. The walls speak when no one is listening. The dolls know more than they reveal. Isolation is not a choice, but an inheritance. Each word felt like a thread pulling her deeper into a narrative she was both terrified and compelled to understand. The letters revealed a woman trapped not just by physical circumstances, but by something more insidious. A psychological landscape that seemed to blur the boundaries between reality and delusion. Clara recognized her own recent experiences mirrored in her grandmother's writings. The sense of being watched, the feeling that the very walls of the mansion were alive, the growing suspicion that something beyond normal perception was manipulating her reality. "We are not mad," one letter read. "We are simply more attuned to the dimensions others cannot perceive." The red strings connecting the documents seemed to pulse with a life of their own, creating patterns that looked almost like neural networks, or perhaps something more sinister. Clara stepped back, her breath catching in her throat as she realized she was no longer just researching her family history. She was tracking a genealogy of madness. Outside, the Victorian mansion loomed, its windows like vacant eyes watching her descent into a history that refused to remain buried. The dollhouse waited in the next room, its miniature rooms seemingly more real with each passing moment. Clara understood now that some inheritances cannot be refused. Some legacies choose their inheritors. Chapter 4. The library's ancient reading room smelled of dust and forgotten knowledge. Pale afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across shelves packed with leather-bound volumes. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision, spreading out a constellation of documents across the scarred oak table. Clara leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. The photographs were yellowed, edges curling like brittle leaves. Her grandmother, younger, sharper-eyed than in the faded family portraits, stood in a stark laboratory setting. White walls. Antiseptic lighting. Her figure cast impossible shadows that seemed to bend and twist unnaturally against the clinical background. "These were taken in 1963, Sarah murmured, her finger tracing the edge of a particularly haunting image. "Your grandmother was part of a research team studying something unconventional." The journal lay open between them. Clara's fingers hovered over the pages, not quite touching. Geometric diagrams spiraled across the margins, impossible shapes that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Cryptic notes in her grandmother's precise handwriting spoke of dimensional permeability and quantum entanglement beyond observable parameters. "What does this mean?" Clara's voice emerged as a whisper. Sarah's expression darkened. She pulled out a stack of newspaper clippings, each marked with ominous red question marks. "Disappearances," she said flatly. "Every member of your grandmother's research team vanished within a 2-year period. No traces, no explanations." A sudden chill rippled through the room. The dollhouse Clara had brought, sitting quietly on a nearby table, began to emit an unnatural blue-green phosphorescent glow. The light pulsed in perfect synchronization with the research documents, creating an electric atmosphere that made the hair on Clara's arms stand on end. "Jesus," Clara breathed. The glow intensified. The geometric diagrams in the journal seemed to move, to breathe, to pulse with an inner life that defied rational explanation. Clara's pupils dilated, her mind struggling to comprehend the chilling possibility before her. Sarah's hand gripped hers. "Your grandmother wasn't just doing research. She was trying to breach something. Something that wasn't meant to be breached." The dollhouse's glow reached a crescendo. For a moment, just a moment, Clara could have sworn the miniature rooms inside seemed to expand, to breathe, to exist beyond their prescribed dimensions. "What was she trying to do?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Sarah's response was barely a whisper. She was trying to create a doorway. The documents rustled, though no wind moved through the library. The dollhouse continued its phosphorescent dance, a silent witness to revelations that threatened to unravel everything Clara thought she knew about her family, about reality itself. Something watched. Something waited. And Clara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to her core, that her grandmother's experiments were far from finished. Chapter 5. The moonlight sliced through the bedroom's heavy curtains, casting angular shadows across Clara's trembling hands. She sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the dollhouse, a miniature prison of memories and secrets that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The porcelain rocking chair moved first. Just a subtle shift, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. Its wooden runners creaked against the dollhouse floor, a sound that echoed with impossible volume in the silent room. No breeze stirred, no human touch guided its movement. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The temperature around her plummeted, frost-like tendrils of cold wrapping around her shoulders. Her hair lifted slightly, strands dancing to an unseen rhythm. The dollhouse wallpaper, previously a delicate Victorian rose pattern, began to twist. Soft pink petals darkened, transforming into thorny vines that seemed to pulse with a malevolent heartbeat. Whispers emerged, fragmented, layered. "Inheritance," a spectral voice murmured. "Family secrets." Her grandmother's voice. Unmistakable, yet distorted like sound traveling through water, rippling and strange. Clara's hand inched forward, fingers trembling. The miniature staircase within the dollhouse warped, its wooden steps bending at impossible angles. A tiny figurine, a miniature version of herself, began to move. Not dropped, not pushed. Moving of its own volition. Its painted eyes rotated slowly, mechanically, until they locked directly with Clara's. Those porcelain eyes held something beyond glass and pigment, a consciousness, a malevolent intelligence. The miniature Clara started climbing, not walking, but climbing, scaling the dollhouse walls with a precision that defied gravity. Each step was calculated, deliberate. The tiny figure moved like a spider, limbs bending at unnatural angles. Around her, the real bedroom seemed to contract. Shadows lengthened. The air grew thick, heavy with an unspeakable presence. Inside the dollhouse, rooms began to bleed into one another, walls melted and reformed. Furniture rearranged itself with surgical precision, a chair here, a table there, as if guided by an unseen conductor. For a moment, a spectral hand materialized, pale and translucent, manipulating the miniature world like an intricate game board. Clara's rational mind screamed for explanation. But deeper down, in the primal core of her being, she recognized the truth. This was no mere haunting. This was a deliberate invasion. Her grandmother's spirit wasn't just watching, it was hunting. "You can't escape," the whispers continued. "This is your inheritance." The dollhouse figurine continued its impossible climb, its painted smile growing wider with each unnatural movement. Clara felt something fundamental shifting. The boundaries between reality and illusion dissolving like watercolor paintings left in the rain. She was no longer just observing the dollhouse. She was becoming part of it. The spectral hand emerged again, this time reaching beyond the miniature world. Translucent fingers stretched toward Clara, promising something between a caress and a threat. And in that moment, Clara understood. This was a battle for more than just her sanity. This was a battle for her very existence. Chapter 6. The wallpaper breathed. Clara's fingers hovered just millimeters from the surface, watching in paralyzed fascination as the delicate floral pattern rippled like water, its edges bleeding between the dollhouse and the mansion's actual wall. Thin tendrils of faded rose and sage green seemed to pulse, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that mimicked shallow, desperate breathing. She blinked. Once. Twice. The porcelain doll in the miniature parlor chose that moment to move. A hairline fracture split across its painted cheek as its head slowly rotated. Ceramic clicked against ceramic, a sound like brittle bones shifting. Its glassy eyes, blue as winter ice, locked onto Clara with unmistakable intention. No longer a passive object, but a predator tracking its prey. Clara stumbled backward, her heel catching on an ornate Persian rug. The room around her seemed to inhale, walls expanding and contracting like a living membrane. Shadows from the dollhouse miniatures stretched impossibly large across the mansion's walls, phantom furniture casting silhouettes of objects that didn't exist in physical space. Her breath caught in her throat. When she turned, the doorway to her grandmother's study had transformed. What should have been a familiar corridor now opened into a scaled-down replica, where furniture seemed to breathe and contract with each of her own ragged breaths. A mahogany desk shrank, then swelled, its proportions elastic and nightmarish. "This isn't real," Clara whispered, though the words felt like a futile protest against the growing madness. The antique mirror mounted on the far wall offered no comfort. Her reflection fractured into impossible perspectives, her full-size self overlaid with a miniature doll version, both images flickering like damaged film, and behind them, barely visible but undeniably present, her grandmother's spectral form watched with cold, calculating eyes. Grandmother Sylvia had always been a woman of precise control. Even in death, apparently, that hadn't changed. Clara's fingers trembled as she reached toward the dollhouse. Each movement felt weighted, like walking through thick molasses. The miniature world seemed to anticipate her, tiny furniture subtly repositioning themselves in anticipation of her touch. A memory surfaced, her grandmother's voice, brittle as aged paper. Everything has its place. Everything can be arranged. The dollhouse walls pulsed. The mansion's walls responded in kind, breathing in synchronicity. Dimensional boundaries blurred, reality becoming a malleable substance to be molded by unseen hands. Clara understood then that this was no longer just about a haunted dollhouse. This was a battle for dimensional supremacy, and her grandmother's spirit was methodically dismantling the barriers between worlds. One impossible room at a time. Chapter 7. The attic's musty air pressed against Clara's skin like damp gauze, thick with the scent of forgotten memories and decaying wood. Sunlight filtered through a single dust-streaked window, casting elongated shadows that seemed to twist and writhe around the Victorian dollhouse. Her grandmother's final, most insidious creation sat perfectly still, yet Clara could feel its malevolent presence watching her. The hammer felt impossibly heavy in her trembling hands. Each breath came ragged and sharp, a desperate rhythm of defiance and fear. She had planned this moment meticulously, a single decisive strike to shatter the dollhouse's supernatural hold over her. Her muscles coiled with intention, arm raised, ready to deliver a crushing blow that would end this nightmare. But something was wrong. As her hammer began its downward arc, the miniature furniture inside the dollhouse shifted. Imperceptibly at first, then with a deliberate, calculated movement. Her strike missed by millimeters, the tool whistling through empty space. A hairline crack spread across the hammer's wooden handle like a spider's web, weakening it in an instant. Clara stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The dollhouse remained perfectly composed, its intricate details mocking her futile attempt at resistance. "No," she whispered, "I won't let you win." Desperation drove her next move. From her grandmother's ancient botanical collection, she gathered salt and dried herbs, sage, rosemary, and protective botanicals passed down through generations. Her fingers traced careful sigils on the wooden floor, each symbol a desperate prayer against the supernatural force that surrounded her. But even as she completed each protective mark, they began to blur. The salt dissolved without moisture, the herb-drawn lines smudging into meaningless patterns. It was as if the very act of creation was being systematically erased. The phone felt cold and heavy when she dialed the paranormal investigator. Her voice trembled as she described the dollhouse's impossible behaviors. "Something's controlling it," Clara insisted, her words tumbling out in a frantic stream. Static erupted across the line. The investigator's voice became a distorted whisper. "Generational consequences," he muttered, the words fragmented and unclear. Then silence. Clara collapsed onto the attic floor, the rough wooden planks pressing against her cheek. Defeat settled over her like a shroud. Within the dollhouse, miniature shadows seemed to dance, a grotesque celebration of her helplessness. Her grandmother's presence permeated everything, not just in the physical space, but in the very air itself. Each breath felt like an invitation, each movement a manipulation. The dollhouse wasn't just an object, it was a living conduit of supernatural intention. Tiny figures within the miniature rooms began to subtly reposition themselves. A porcelain doll turned its head, impossibly, to face her. Its painted eyes held an expression of cold, calculated triumph. Clara understood then the true depth of her predicament. This wasn't just about a haunted dollhouse. This was psychological warfare, and her grandmother had been preparing the battlefield long before Clara had even arrived. The shadows lengthened. The dollhouse waited. Chapter 8. Clara's fingers trembled as they traced the intricate wooden frame of the dollhouse mirror. Moonlight pooled like mercury across its surface, transforming the glass into a shimmering membrane between worlds. She knew crossing this boundary meant entering her grandmother's most intimate domain, a realm where reality bent like fragile paper, where memories became weapons. As she stepped forward, her reflection fractured. Hundreds of Claras splintered across the mirror's surface, some young, some aged, some transparent as mist. Each reflection moved slightly out of sync, creating a kaleidoscopic portrait of potential selves. The sensation was like stepping through layers of thin ice, each membrane more fragile than the last. The air grew dense, charged with an electricity that made the tiny hairs on her arms stand rigid. Whispers, fragments of forgotten conversations, brushed against her ears. Phantom threads began to weave around her, gossamer thin yet stronger than steel cables, seeking to bind her spiritual essence. "You cannot escape what is inherited," a voice emerged, simultaneously ancient and youthful. Grandmother Sylvia materialized, not as a singular form, but as a fluid projection cycling through different ages. One moment she was a stern elderly woman with sharp, calculating eyes. The next, a vibrant young woman whose smile held predatory intensity. The mansion around them pulsed like a living organism. Walls breathed and contracted, rooms folding and unfolding like origami. Ornate wallpaper rippled with ghostly patterns, antique furniture shifting positions without physical intervention. Claire recognized this was no ordinary space. This was her grandmother's psychological landscape, a realm where thought and matter intertwined. "You think you can resist?" Sylvia's spectral form drifted closer, phantom threads extending like serpentine tendrils. "Our bloodline has always been about control, preservation, continuation." Clara stood her ground, feeling something awakening within her, a nascent spiritual power she'd never acknowledged before. "Preservation isn't control," she responded, her voice surprisingly steady. "It's imprisonment." The antique mirror beside her suddenly liquefied, becoming a window into memory. Clara watched, transfixed, as scenes from her grandmother's life played out in fragmented sequences. She saw the young Sylvia, brilliant and frustrated, surrounded by societal constraints. She witnessed the moment Sylvia discovered her first supernatural abilities, the power to manipulate reality through these intricate dollhouse connections. Each memory was a thread, a potential chain intended to bind future generations. Clara understood now, this wasn't just about control, but about a generational trauma seeking perpetual expression. "You're trying to complete a cycle," Clara realized aloud, "using the dollhouse to trap and recreate family narratives." Sylvia's form flickered, momentarily destabilized by Clara's understanding. The mansion's walls trembled, cracks appearing like lightning strikes across their surface. Clara raised her hand, not physically, but through a spiritual gesture. She felt something fundamental shift, an internal resistance breaking free. The phantom threads attempting to bind her began to splinter, ethereal strands disintegrating like frost under sudden heat. "No more," she whispered. The dollhouse realm began to fracture around them, reality itself becoming a delicate, breaking construct. Sylvia's spectral form writhed, caught between manifestation and dissolution. Their battle was just beginning. Chapter 9. The attic's filtered light cast long shadows across Clara's trembling hands. Dust danced around her fingers as she carved, each careful stroke of the tiny knife revealing incremental details of her own likeness. The miniature figurine emerged slowly, a perfect replica, from the slight curve of her shoulders to the determined set of her jaw. Silence pressed against her ears, broken only by the whisper of blade against wood and her own measured breathing. Outside the attic's single window, late afternoon sunlight bled into the overgrown gardens, casting the mansion in a sickly amber glow. She knew she was being watched. The spectral presence of her grandmother lingered at the edges of perception. A cold draft, a peripheral shimmer, the weight of unseen eyes tracking her every movement. The dollhouse stood before her, a meticulous replica of the mansion itself. Its intricate rooms waited, each miniature space a perfect mirror of the actual chambers below. Clara's fingers, steady now despite their earlier trembling, positioned the small figurine with surgical precision. As the doll Clara settled into place, a sudden chill swept through the attic. The grandmother's spirit surged forward, a predatory movement that seemed to compress the very air. Tendrils of spectral energy twisted around the dollhouse, hungry and triumphant. "Finally," The wind seemed to whisper, a sound more felt than heard. "You understand." But Clara's eyes, sharp, calculating, betrayed no submission. A subtle smile played at the corner of her mouth, so slight it might have been a trick of the fading light. Her hand hovered above the dollhouse's wooden base. Beneath her palm, barely visible, an intricate sigil gleamed, ancient symbols etched with mathematical precision, their edges sharp enough to cut reality itself. The mansion around her began to shift. Walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like membranes, perspective warped, distances stretched and compressed. The dollhouse at the center remained perfectly still, a fixed point in a reality suddenly gone fluid. Her grandmother's spirit realized something was wrong a moment too late. The triumphant cold began to twist, to contract. What had been a surge of victory transformed into a desperate pulling force. Clara pressed her palm against the sigil. Reality fractured. The dimensional boundaries, those gossamer-thin membranes separating worlds, began to crack and splinter. The spectral energy that had been her grandmother's triumphant essence suddenly reversed, pulling inward with violent intensity. A scream began, whether from Clara or the spirit, it was impossible to tell. The sound was both physical and metaphysical, a rupture that transcended human hearing. The dollhouse remained unchanged, perfectly still, waiting. Clara's miniature figure stood motionless within its miniature room, a silent sentinel at the moment of transformation. Outside, the mansion's windows flickered. For just an instant, the world outside seemed to pause, suspended between breaths, between realities. Then everything shifted. Chapter 10. The walls breathed. Clara knew this was impossible, but impossibility had long since abandoned meaning in this house. The Victorian wallpaper, once crisp ivory with delicate blue filigree, seemed to pulse and contract, its intricate patterns warping like water around her trembling fingers. A low, ancient creak echoed through the room. Not the familiar settling of old wood, but something more deliberate, something hungry. Her peripheral vision blurred first. Clara blinked, hoping to clear the distortion, but the edges of reality continued to fold inward. The ornate mirror across the room compressed, its gilded frame shrinking like cooling wax. Furniture seemed to contract, miniaturizing with horrifying precision. "No," she whispered, though the word emerged as a thin, reedy sound. Her hands, her beautiful, living hands, began to change. Porcelain-smooth skin hardened. Joints stiffened. Where flesh had been moments before, a glossy, artificial surface now gleamed under the dim light. In the room's shadowed corner, a spectral figure materialized. Her grandmother. Not the warm-skinned woman from faded photographs, but a translucent apparition with eyes like shards of ice. Those eyes, ancient, calculating, watched Clara's transformation with detached satisfaction. "You're part of the collection now," the grandmother's voice whispered, neither loud nor soft, but existing somewhere between memory and sound. Clara tried to scream. Only a delicate, high-pitched sound escaped, the kind of noise a porcelain doll might make if it could truly speak. Her consciousness remained horrifyingly intact, trapped within this diminishing form. The dollhouse, that meticulously crafted miniature world she'd studied so intently, was no longer just an object. It was becoming her entire universe. Walls compressed, proportions shifted. What had been a massive Victorian mansion now transformed into an intricate, scaled replica. Each movement felt predetermined. Each breath, if she could still call it breathing, seemed choreographed by an unseen hand. Her grandmother's hand. The ghostly figure drifted closer, more substantial with each moment of Clara's reduction. Translucent fingers reached out, almost touching her transforming form. "Welcome home," she murmured. Clara's world continued to shrink. The massive rooms collapsed into perfectly proportioned miniature spaces. Ornate furniture became delicate replicas. Paintings shrank, their brushstrokes becoming microscopic details preserved with impossible precision. Her final moments of humanity condensed into a singular, terrifying realization. She was becoming exactly what her grandmother had always intended, another carefully curated piece, another story frozen in porcelain and memory, the last vestiges of her human form dissolved, consciousness contracted, preserved, trapped within a meticulously painted surface. Her new body, perfectly positioned among the grandmother's other dolls, frozen in an eternal, silent scream. The dollhouse stood silent, complete, perfect. Another generation's story collected and contained.